So, Yom Rishon today, Sunday, it's Yud Zayin, Tov, Sivan, the 17th day in the month of Sivan. And it's Pasha Shlach, right? The Meraglim, Pasha Shlach. Now, we're learning Tanya, Kedat Kenu, on Sundays we learn Tanya. And Tanya we try very hard not to skip. It's one of the only things that no matter what's going on, Tanya we try to hold on to. And we're starting Perek Beis. V'nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael, the second life force, the second soul that a Yid has, Hi chelek elaka mimal, it's a piece of elaka, of godliness, mimal from above, mash. K'mei shekosov, it says in the pasuk, Vayipach bi'apov nishmas chayim. This pasuk is written by Adam Harishon specifically. One man, Vayipach ba'apov nishmas chayim, the Eibush that blew into his nostrils a breath of life. And again, I want to emphasize a point that I always say, and it gets so confusingly lost on people. Adam was created yupartufim nivru. The Gemara says, Rashi brings it. In the account of creation, in the story of the Bria, of creation, Adam was created Zochar and Nekeva. They were created together. A man and a woman were created physically attached. That's how it was created. The operation, the surgery that's described in the Chumash was not creating Chava. It's called in Kabbalah Nesireh, to separate. Adam and Chava were created together. But the Gemara says this. This is not saying from Kabbalah. The Gemara says this. Adam and Chava created a being, Zochar and Nekeva. In other words, the Eibishter created animals. He created Zocharim separately, and he created Nekeva separately. When the Eibishter created human beings, he created Zochar and Nekeva together. Then he separated them, and then they have to become reunified. And of course, Al Pi Kabbalah, this is the idea of Palga Gufa with Neshamis. But when the Eibishter created Adam and Chava, they created Zochar and Nekeva together. So when it says Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, it's talking about Adam before the Nesira, before the operation, before the separation. So this pasuk is written by Adam Rishon. Then it says V'ato nafachta bi. This is in Siddur. In the Lakai Neshama, you blew into me. And of course, the way it's explained is that you shouldn't think that only the first person, only Adam Rishon, that the Eibush to blow into his nostrils a breath of life, and the rest of us don't have this Indian. So the Alter Rebbe brings from Siddur that just like by Adam Rishon it says like Yipach, Hashem blew into the nose of Adam Rishon and Neshama. The Eibush that also blows into the Neshama of each human, into the goof of each human being, and Neshama in a way of Neficha. The Rebbe asks a question that nobody would think of asking. In Siddur it says V'ato nefachta bi without a vav. You know that? Alakai, the shomash and asata bi teheri atavrasa ati yitzarta ato nefachta bi ve ato mishamra b'kebi. How come there's a vav ve ato nefachta bi which doesn't say Siddur? So the simple teretz is because it's following the first proof. Since he brought a proof from pasuk by Adam Rishon, by Yipav, Hashem blew into his nostrils the breath of life. So he's bringing a second raya, so the vav is not going on the nusach of the Siddur, the vav is going on the nusach of the Tanya. There's a raya by Adam Rishon, Eibishter blew into his natural breath of life, and there's a raya by each person, Eibishter blew into each one of us on his shama. So anyway, we have two rayas, one from a pasuk about Adam Rishon, and one from Siddur about each person. Okay, so what does that mean? What does that mean that the Eibishter blew the neshama into each person? So he brings K'mei shekosa b'zeyah. On this idea of Vayipach and Nafachta, this is Zayah. The Zayah says, and by the way, for the record, this Zayah does not exist. The Zayah does not exist. The Rebbe has a long ha'ara where the Rebbe says in Zayah Shteitis Nish, and the Rebbe is looking for sources for this. The Rebbe writes the first words, Bevadai Nema came b'Zayar ela shalei higil yadenu. If the Alter Rebbe says it says in Zayar, it says in Zayar, but we don't have the whole Zayar because the Zayar was buried in the ground for 1,000 years, and when they took it out of the ground, they had to piece together mamish remnants. In other words, we have no idea how big the Zayar was. It's much bigger than the Zayar that we have. If you ever look in your printed Zayar, if you don't look on some Katainis, all over the Zayar you'll have parenthesis Chaser and because the Zayar was put together from a manuscript that was buried. Anyway, so if the Alter Rebbe says, if the Alter Rebbe says Isa b'Zeir, it says Zeir. But in the Zeir that we have, it doesn't say. There's other Kabbalah Sfarim who say it nevertheless. Man de nafach mitachir nafach. When one who blows, he blows from his innermost parts. Pirush, this means mitechiyusei umipnimiyusei. From his innards and from his depths. Now those translations could have been just as well from his depths and from his innards. Toich has two translations, right? Toich could mean what's inside, and toich could mean what is the substance of something, right? Pnimius means the face, what you see on the face, and pnimius means also what's on the inside. So it says in the Zehar, Mitechi Yusei mepnimi Yusei, Taishes Alter Rebbe, Shetechius upnimius achayes shaba'adam, the innermost and the deepest and the most pnimiistic of the life of a person, might say he brings out, he extracts, but if he chosei bekeach, when he blows with all of his strength. So the Alter Rebbe begins Perek Beis by making a statement that the neshama is a chelik alakam imal mamish. There's a guy who's mamish on a vendetta. He's written articles in the Jewish press 25 years ago, 30 years ago. Every once in a while he rears his ugly head, and he's so angry about this shtickle Tanya, he goes nuts. Of course there's a Metadas Nidzagan and Agan Samais. He writes all these articles against the Alter Rebbe. He's quoting the Tanya. What he doesn't know is that what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya was written hundreds of years before the Alter Rebbe. It says in Sifrei Kabbalah. Sifrei Kabbalah, the Rebbe brings a Shefat Al. Also, Greisim Kubalim. In other words, when you start up with Alter Rebbe and you don't know who you're starting up with, you don't realize how you're making yourself look bad. Every once in a while he'll send us the same article. We get so upset. How could you say Neshama is a beast? The Alter Rebbe did not invent the idea. The idea is written earlier. And what's interesting is the Alshich. The Alshich was B'chal Mara Makubal. The Alshich is a darshan, and the Alshich calls the Neshama B'kviyas. When the Alshich refers to the Neshama, the Alter Rebbe did not invent the term. The Alter Rebbe added a word, mamish. Chelik Elakami Mal is originally a pasuk. The emphasis, the three words, Chelik Elakami Mal, is a Lashon pasuk someplace. In Eiv, I think. Eiv, Lamed of Beis. Alter Rebbe adds the word mamish. But the context that the Neshama is called a Chelik Elakami Mal, and mamish is written, Chelik Elakami Mal Zicher is written in front of the Alter Rebbe. Alter Rebbe says the second Neshama that a Yid has is a Chelik Elakami Mal mamish. It brings a raya, because the Eibishter blows into the Neshamas Yisrael a breath of life. Now let's continue to read. Kach al derech moshel Neshamas Yisrael. Just like we described before the two dots, that the Eibishter blows. And we know that when somebody blows, he blows from his deepest depths. And therefore we understand that when the Eibishter created a Yid, and he gave him life by blowing neshama into his nostrils, that it's techiyus or pnimiyus, it's the depth of Elokus, which is called chelik elakam mimal mamish. The same is true how you understand it in the language of Kabbalah. In other words, what was before the two dots and what's after the two dots is exactly the same thing, but close. But Pratius, it's very different. We're going to talk about it. But how is it the same? Before the two dots, Alter Rebbe brings what we would call Chsidische Werte, Chsidische Oisies, that the Eibishter blew into the Guf of Adam Rishon, into every year the Neshama. And because he blew it, it came from his deepest depth. How do you say this in the language of Kabbalah? So the Alter Rebbe continues, that it says in Chazal, Yisrael olu b'machshava, that the Jewish people entered in the Eibishter's thought, and this is a medrash. And Yisrael Olu B'machshava is the introduction of the Alter Rebbe to explaining the terminology Chelik Elakami Mal Mamish in the language of Kabbalah as opposed to the language of Chassidus. That's how I'm teaching it to you. Before the two dots, Alter Rebbe says how you understand Al Pi Chassidus, and after the two dots, he's explaining how you understand Al Pi Kabbalah. Yidden went up in the Eibishter's thought. Now, the Eibishter created everything how? By speaking. The Eibishter created everything how? By speaking. Correct? So what did we have before the two dots? Before the two dots it says like this. All of the creations that the Eibishter made, he spoke. What about Adam Rishon? He also spoke, but he blew. Now, when was the last time you tried to speak and blow at the same time? It can't happen, right? You can either blow or you can speak, but you can't speak and blow. Why? Because in order for a person to speak words, their air has to be moderated, has to be modulated, there has to be mitzimtzum. When you speak words, the amount of air coming out of your lungs has to be measured very precisely. And I don't understand all the biology, but it has to hit this nerve and that. This, the other thing is l'harois kum and koil, which come out in a reasonable and an audible and in a step by step, one sound after a second sound after a third sound and so on. The Eibishter somehow pulled off to speak and blow at the same time in creating the Neshama Yisrael. This is what says in Chumash. What does it say in Kabbalah? The same idea, Bisala Andesh. All of the Eibishter's creations, he spoke. Ayid, he thought. All of the Eibishter's creations come from Dibur, come from the Eibishter's speech. The Neshama Yisrael come from the Eibishter's machshava. And of course they also point out the Lashon of the Medrash is Yisrael olu b'machshava. Yisrael olu b'machshava. And it's translated by Marei Chasidus, this whole Maimorim on this Medrash, b'bechinas elyoynoi sheb'machshava. There's a lot of madreges of machshava. Yisrael olu b'machshava is go to the highest source of machshava, wherever that is. And a Yid is Oyla, Yid was Oyla in the Machshav of the Eibush on these highest Madregas. Okay, so this Medrash is saying, in other words, what we had before the two dots. Before the two dots we said Vayipach, the Eibishter blew, as opposed to speaking. After the two dots we're saying, the Eibishter thought, as opposed to speaking. You understand? In other words, there's a lot of similarity, but it's still different. What do we gain by saying that Yisrael all over Machshavas? He brings the pasuk. Kiliksiv, it has two pasukim. The first pasuk is B'ni B'cheiri Yisrael. Eibishter says in the very beginning that Yid is my firstborn in Pasha Shmeis. Ke Yoman Ad Hashem B'ni B'cheiri Yisrael. That the Yid is my firstborn. And then later on in the Torah it's written Bonim Atem La'avaya Lekeich. That every Jew is a son, is a child, is an offspring of the Eibishter. Now, how did we go from thought to children? How do you go from a thought to Ben? So the Alter Rebbe answers, Peter, when you say thought, technically, literally, a thought means something that crosses your consciousness. But b'pnimius, a thought means something that comes from the brain. Just like we understand in biology. This is taka biology. The Sananda biology, the biology of Torah, a son. Nim Shachmeach Ha'af comes from the brain of his father. Kach Kvayachol, so too. Similarly, Nishmas Kol Ish Yisrael, the neshama of every single Jew. Nim Shecha Mimachshavte, comes from the Eibishter's thought. But since Yisrael Olov Machshava doesn't mean stam thought, it means El Yenesh Machshava. Whatever level of thought there is, the Yid comes from there. Higher and higher and higher ad ein kates. So the Alter Rebbe says the Chochmah says, when you say that a Yid comes from the Eibishter's thought, it means even the thought on the Madrega of Chochmah. That whatever levels of thought that you could say by the Eibishter, and Chochmah is the highest Madrega Kvayachol, the Eibishter, the Neshama comes from there. I'll show you. Okay, so now this is how the mathematics works. The Medrash says we come from the Eibishter's Machshava. We understand that means the highest Madregas Machshava, even Chochmah. And the Alter Rebbe says the fact is a child comes from the brain of his father. Right? A baby is born. The Lashon HaKabbalah, there's a tipa, there's a point, there's a seed, there's a tipa sadchad, there's a point that comes from the Zohar, there's a tipa sanukfur, there's a point that comes from the Nekeva. Al pi Torah, it comes from the brain. It's nizbashel, there's a whole process of how it happens, b'poyo, but it comes from the brain. And there's a chap. There's a chap. What's the chap? What's the chap? The chap is pashut. Can you give all of yourself away to somebody else? Can you give your whole self away to somebody else? Can I give me to you? That's an interesting question. And by the way, the first step in answering that question would be another question. Do I own me to be able to give me away to you? Which is an interesting way of deflecting the question. Can you give your whole self to somebody else? So in Chassidus there's a sugya. And the sugya in Chassidus is called Oyer V'Shefa. Oyer V'Shef. Oid v'shefa is the Kabbalistic way to say apples and oranges. Here's the difference. We'll start with shefa. Shefa goes along with the word mashpia. Shefa goes along with the word mashpia. A shefa and hashpa means I'm giving you something of substance, something that has real value. For example, I came to class today and I'm teaching you, so I'm giving you my time, but hopefully I prepared. I actually did prepare. Yeah. I came to class and I'm teaching you ideas, so I had to decide what I'm going to teach, I had to decide how I'm going to teach it. There's a lot of effort in being a mashpia of shefa. The effort of being mashpia of shefa is deciding what to teach and how to teach and what not to teach. So you have to go into a lot of, you have to invest yourself in the Talmidim or the Talmidas and decide how you're going to give the information in such a way that it's going to be constructive. But there's a catch in shefa. What's the catch in shefa? That because a teacher must engage with his student in planning what and how he's going to teach, and he certainly must engage with his students in proactively teaching. A mashpia is giving something limited. What the mashpia gives has to be b'medidah v'agvala, but the mashpia has to give himself. You can't do this passively. You can't do this b'derech agav. You can't give something substantive to somebody else without paying attention. And if you give something substantive to somebody else, you must pay attention. So even if what you're giving is very small, you're giving a piece of you. It's like the person who gives tzedakah with a smile. The tzedakah is $1. The smile is priceless. It's the person. All hashpa, if there is hashpa, has two rules. Rule number one is there must be tzimtzum. And rule number two, in the Lashon HaChasidus, says there's a shinui in the mashpia. The mashpia is nitfas. The hashpa that's coming from the mashpia to the makabel involves the teacher. You have to give of yourself in order to give. This is one breder. So now, let me ask you the question again. When a mashpia is giving shefa, is he giving all of himself? Not giving all of himself. It's an interesting question, right? Interesting question. Mitadechel, of course, he's giving all of himself. Why? Because at the moment that he's giving the hashpa, he's doing nothing else. And if you do anything else, it'd be a terrible mashpia. Has to be focused. Le'idach, he's giving all of himself in terms of his engagement. But what's actually reaching the makabel is a small piece of one part of who he is. If it's an act of kindness, it's a little piece of his heart. If it's an idea of seichel, it's a small piece of his intelligence, and so forth. Right? So this is one model. Is he giving his whole self? Yes, because he's engaged. And no, because that's not what the Talmud is receiving. Because he can't give everything. Impossible. You got it? I think that wasn't so complicated. Option A. Option B is called Oyer. Oyer. What's Oyer? Oyer means, the parallel word for Oyer is Mo'er, a source for light and light. The rule of Oyer and Mo'er is exactly the opposite of Shafa in both Piratim. It's Memele. Light does, the source, the sun doesn't give you light. The sun suns. The sun is, or the sun bees. That's all the sun does. The sun is busy being a sun. The fact that it's Me'el Ha'aretz V'Adarim Aleh is entirely Memele. It happens by itself. So the sun's light carries the whole sun. Oyer Me'ein HaMoyer, let me see this. Oyer Me'ein HaMoyer, whatever you have in the source, you have in the light. So light is a replica of the source. So if you're talking about the Eibishter's Oyer, we call it Oyer Ein Seif. Whatever you have Koyach on the Moyer, you have an Oyer. So the Oyer Moyer model gives everything, but it's giving nothing. Why? Because you can't do it on purpose. Oyer is not a mashpia. A moyer is not a mashpia, it's a moyer. You can't give your whole self. Somebody else can take from you your light. I mean, and physically, yeah? What is the oyer of the human being? His countenance, how he looks. The face of a person. You look at a person's face, of course, depending on the person who's being observed, and certainly depending on the person doing the observing. You can look at a face and see more or see less and so on. But the face of a person reveals a lot. It reveals everything, safe kosei. But it reveals it memele. It reveals it b'derech oyer. In other words, in the oyer moyer model, the source is giving everything of himself in the form of light, but it has to be disengaged. It cannot be given, because the moment it's giving, it's simple. So you have two systems. Everyone has the chesaron of the other, and the Maile, it's different in the end. In Shefa, I'm giving you all of me, but I'm only giving you a little bit. In Ayr, I'm giving you nothing and you're getting everything. So is there a perfect model? Is there something which has the everything of Ayr and the Pnimius of Shefa? And there's only one thing. What parents give children. Parents give their children everything. 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 A child is not a parent's idea. A child's not a piece of art or a piece of music. A child is another parent. Whatever the parent is, the child is. And of course, the way you explain it in psychological terms, what is the greatest gift your parents gave you? Is the ability for you to separate from them. And to have your own mind and your own heart and your own free will, which is interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, as children and as parents, it's interesting. But this is what it is. If you hold on to your kids, you ruin them. The greatest thing you give to your children is the greatest thing your parents gave you, an etzem. What is an etzem? You came from them and you belong to you. That's what it is. You came from them and you belong to you. How could I come from them and belong to you? Because they belong to themselves. And because they belong to themselves, they were able to give you the you should belong to you. You get it? Not they belong to themselves, so you belong to you. They belong to themselves, so they're able to give you what they got from their parents at their Metzias b'fnei atzmi. It has to come dafke in a tipa gashmi, it's a the Metzias. But it's called in Chassidus hashpa'a atzmis. This is how it says in Chassidus. There's two models and a third model. In the Shefa Mashpia model, you have one set of milas. In the Oyer Moyer model, you have a different set of milas. And in Hashpa'a atzmis, you have everything. And according to Kabbalah, it comes from the brain. It comes from the brain. The Moyach HaChochma of the person is Begashmias, the essence of the person. It's a physical thing. The whole essence of the person is found in Me'ach HaChochma. And a tipa of Me'ach HaChochma is transmitted from parents to children. There's tipas Hatchar, and tipas Hanukva, a male and female tipa. This is how baby is born. Okay, so when it says, Yisrael, Olav Machshava, that Yidden came into Eibish's Machshava, says the Rebbe, K'moshe Kasu, B'ni B'chayri Yisrael, Bon Amach L'Elokech. I have a Parsha class on this someplace in my website. It's a simple question. When the Torah says we're the Eibish's children, what does that mean? We're the Eibish's children? Hashem got married, Hashem has a wife, when was the Chasaneh? Yeah. Which hospital were the babies delivered in? How are we the Eibish's children? It's a Pashtakash. When it says in the Torah, we're the Eibish's sons, firstborn sons. What does that mean? So of course, when you learn Sifrei Machshava, some will say it's a mashal. Hashem loves us like a firstborn. When you learn Sifrei Machshava, you're not Kabbalah. How do you explain this idea that the Torah says with Eibish's children, Eibish is not a person, Eibish doesn't have babies? There's a Torah, it's a mashal. Of course we're not his children. We're his creations. He loves us and we're like we're his children. But Kabbalah is never happy with these generalizations. If it says a child, it means a child. If we wanted to say he loves us a lot, they would have said he loves us a lot. They would have found words. The Torah says bonim. The Torah says b'ni b'chayri. It means b'chayri. So it has to be literally true. How is it literally true that with Eibish's children? So he Pashat explains it to you. That there is a Seder Ishtalshalus. And at the essence of a Seder Ishtalshalus, there is Chochmah. Or Machshava. And yet the Yiddish neshama, every Jewish neshama comes from Chochmah. And just like physically, parents give, the father and the mother give their child their Chochmah. And in giving to their child their Chochmah, you have what's called a Hashpa Atzmis. They're giving their whole self in a complete way. Not like in Shefa, where they're giving you a little with a lot of kavanah. Or like an they're giving you everything with no kavanah, but they're giving you everything with a lot of kavanah, ashpa, atzmis. Where does that come from? It comes from Chochmah. So the Rebbe made a shidduch between a medrash and a pasuk. You understand? The medrash that says Yisrael ol b'machshava is the same thing in the pasuk that says Bonam atam Hashem alakechem. Who would think these put these medrashim together? Because we don't ever say that when it says in the Torah pasuk, it doesn't mean it. It means al derech moshel. It means al derech remez. It means al derech affection. If we're called the Eibishter's children, then there's truth to it. Al pi Torah, al pi chochma of Torah. What's the chochma of Torah? Yisrael ol b'machshava. Yidden with Eibishter's chochma. And Yisrael ol b'machshava is no different than a physical child. Every physical child comes from the me'ach ha'av. And the me'ach ha'aim come from the brain, the essence. Not the seichel of your father. The pnimius hamayach, the essence of the father, the essence of the mother, is comes out in creating a child that should be in possession of himself, just like the parent is in possession of themselves. And this the touch, because we come from the Eibishter's Machshava. It's exactly the same as any other parent-child relationship where the children come from the Meich of the father. And that's what we call Bon Atam Alekich. And the Alter Rebbe continues, and he says, the Iyu Chakim V'lei B'Chochma Yediyah. But you need to understand that Hashem's Chochma is different than our Chochma. How is Hashem's Chochma different than our Chochma? Because Elohu v'Chochma Seyacha. The Eibishter is one with his Chochma. Iyu Chakim, he is wise, but V'lei B'Chochma Yediyah, not like Chochma that we know, because Hu v'Chochma Seyacha, Hashem is one with his Chochma. Now I'm going to give you Kabbalistic speeches in the weeks to come. But here's the pashtus. It says in the Rambam that Hu HaYedeya and Hu HaYedu and Hu HaMadir, which means Hu HaChocham, Hu HaMach, Hu HaChochma. Hashem is one with his Chochma. However we understand the Lomdis and the Pilpul, we're leaving that for another time. But when you say that it comes from the Eibishter's Chochma, that's the same thing you're saying, Chelik Elokam Imal Mamish. Before the two dots, we said Chelik Elokam Imal Mamish. After the dots, we're saying Yisrael all of Machshava means Chochma. Says the Alter Rebbe did the same. Coming from the Eibishter's Chochma and being Chelik Elokam Imal Mamish are the same. Why? Of all things, Azay steht in the Rambam. Rambam. Yeah? What steht in the Rambam? Or Kumesha Kosov, Rambam, it says in Rambam, Shu Amadav, Hu Hayedeya, V'chul. The Eibishter is the knowledge, the knower, and the known. In other words, Hashem and His wisdom are one. So if I had to say it in a few words, I would say, Chacha Filu, even though Hashem is Ein Seif, and much higher than Ein Seif, Ein Tchila, nevertheless, somehow the Eibishter's Chachma and this Eibishter that's Ein Seif and Ein Tchila are one and the same. And saying that a Yid comes from the Eibishter's Chachma is the same thing as saying that a Yid is a Chelik Elokam Imal Mamish. And the Rambam himself admits, it's not easy to understand what it means that the Eibishter has Chachma and the Eibishter and his Chachma are one. And he brings two psukim. If you will search God, will you then find him? He brings the second pasuk. And Hashem's thought is different than our thought. So the Rambam says it's very difficult or impossible to understand this idea, but it is nevertheless a fact. Hashem and His Chochma are one. Therefore, when you bring a medrash that says that a Yid is coming from the Eibishter's Chochma, that's the same thing as the Zayar that says that the Eibishter blew us. You get it? Okay, stop. We're done reading. We're done reading inside. So you have, the Alter Rebbe makes a statement. The statement is that the second neshama which we have is the Chelik Elokam Imal. It's a piece of the Eibishter Mimal. Mamash, actually, literally. And he brings two proofs. A proof of a pasuk and a proof from a medrash. Why does he bring two proofs? Now these are me speaking, now this is not Alter Rebbe speaking. Because he wants to say it al pi Chassidus, and he wants to qualify it al pi Kabbalah. In other words, Chassidus is different than Kabbalah, and the truth of the matter is, Chassidus is higher than Kabbalah, and lower than Kabbalah. That's the whole thing. Is Kol HaGavaya B'Yesed, Yered Lamata Yesed. But the Alter Rebbe doesn't want to only say it in the language of Chassidus. He wants to say it in the language of Kabbalah also. So first he says the Ma'aseh says, and the Neshama is the Chelik HaMamach. The Eibishter blew a breath of life into each one of us, and when he blew himself. And then he says, how would you say the same thing in the Lashon HaKabbalah that we come from the Eibishter's Chochma? And the Eibishter's Chochma like a father and a mother's Chochma. That's the essence of the parents, and the parents give their child a piece of their essence, which makes the child not a creation of the parents, but a copy of the parents, a naya amtius, there's entity unto itself. And the child being an entity itself means just like the father owns himself, and just like the mother owns herself, right? What is the prerequisite to giving yourself away to your husband in marriage? To own yourself. That's the way it works. I'm sorry, I'm pinigla. A man gives a wife a ring, and he marries her. We don't believe in two rings, right? Two rings is not only a man gives a wife a ring. Why? Because the man is a mashal for the Eibishter, and the wife is a mashal for Knesset Yisrael, and it's okay. It's okay that the woman is taking and the man is giving, but he's acquiring her. But the prerequisite for a man giving a woman a ring and saying Aret Mukdash Li is that she has to belong to herself. You can't marry a child. You can't marry a shaitan. She has her own choice. When she owns herself, just okay. Right? So a parent owns him or herself, I'm just giving you some mashal, and therefore gives that child themselves, which includes that the child doesn't belong to the father, the child doesn't belong to the mother, the child belongs to the child. How? Because there's a nikud of chokhmah, and the nikud of chokhmah is the source of where children are born, and the parents give their child their chokhmah. The Eibishter gave us his chokhmah as well. Okay, so what did I just do? What I did was, it's very important for me that you should understand the idea that the Rebbe brings two rayas for one thing. The thing on the table, the shmuas, the conversation is nefesh Hashem is b'Yisrael l'cheik l'kam ma'mamish. The second nefesh which a yid gets is nefesh l'kis, and he brings two rayas. The difference between the two rayas, the first raya is a simple raya, but simple doesn't mean less. Simple actually means more. This is the raya Chassidus, and the Alter Rebbe insists on bringing a raya also from Kabbalah. In other words, the Alter Rebbe explains it to you how it is in Atzmos, and the Alter Rebbe explains it to you how it is in Ishtalshalus. In Atzmos, a Yid is a chelik ha'mal mamish v'eshteit v'yipach, Eibishter blew. And in Ishtalshalus, what does it mean that a Yid is a chelik ha'mal mamish? That he comes from the Chochmah the Eibishter. Okay? Now there's so many things we're going to have to do in the coming weeks to reread these words and to analyze them better. But I wanted to start with this. This is the Shalom Aleichem, the Perek Beis, with the two dots right there near the beginning of the Perek. The Alter Rebbe wants you to know that this Inyan of Chelik HaMamish is verstanden, it's understood al pi Chassidus, and it's also understood al pi Kabbalah, and therefore brings you the two rayas. So now, there's a lot of things that we need to do. But let's start from the beginning. What's the first thing on our agenda? The very first words, right? Nefesh Hashenis b'Yisrael. Nefesh Hashenis, right? Nefesh Hashenis has the problem unto itself. Why are you calling the neshama Nefesh Hashenis? Why are you calling the soul the Nefesh Elokis, the second soul? Shouldn't the Nefesh Elokis be called the first soul? Yeah, it's like a person saying you have klipa and also there's an Eibishter. It doesn't make any sense. The first thing is the neshama, and the second thing is that there's a lamas v'steidim on the neshama. The way the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya, you have nefesh achas tzad klipa. At the end of the previous page, the first nefesh comes from klipa, and then you have nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael. It's chelik l'kal. Why is the neshama called nefesh hashenis? It's a very simple and very real question, and the answer is just as easy. We're pashtus. Because the Gemara says agdam etanisa. The Rebbe brings all kinds of sources. They made this new book, by the way. It's very, very good. This is the Rishimis. I learned this with you last time. The Rishimis came out 25 years ago, at this point, came out 20 years ago, which is the Rebbe's notes. And they also, but here they did something, they did a good job. They bring from all the Rabbeim, on the Eish, they'll have the Tanya on the top, all the Rabbeim, and on the side here, they bring Makedas, sources. Whatever they know in Makkah, they bring Makedas. But it's from all the Rabbeim. And this is a famous thing. They have over here verschiedene Tzemach Tzedek, Maimer, a ganze Wege Geschmacke Sachen. But anyway, why is the neshama called second? Because she arrived second. The nefesh habamis is the highest of your guf. You wouldn't have a body if you didn't have an animal soul. The nefesh hashenis, the neshama, is added on top of the nefesh habahamis. So the nefesh habahamis obviously comes first. If you exist, if you're a human being, if you're alive, there's life inside you. The life inside you, you have in common with monkeys and with insects and plants and even minerals. Everything that exists has life. A human being has life as well. The life inside a human being makes him be not dead. Okay? And then Nefesh Hashenis. So the neshama is added to a person. A person with only one nefesh is not what the Eibishter created the world for. The nefesh hashenis is added to an already living person. He has a nefesh habahamis. The Eibishter gives him a new neshama. And the Lashon HaGemara is agdem etanisis. The way we understand it is the pashtus. You get your nefesh habahamis when you're born. And the Gemar knisas nefesh elokis, the end of the entry of the divine soul, is by bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah. Right? The tchila, the beginning of the entry. The Gemara speaks about when you get a neshama, and there's a bunch of opinions. There's mishas pkida, mishas yetzira, mishas leida. Pkida means conception. Yetzira means basically 40 days later. And leida means the moment of birth. And everybody brings rayas. So there are shittas when the neshama enters into the person. So the Alter Rebbe writes in Shulchan Aruch that the tchila of the knisa of nefesh elokis is by the bris. The beginning of the neshama's entry into the child after the baby is 8 days old, when he has a bris and he gives him a name. Which is why it says in the Rebbe's letters, and it's now printed in a lot of places, that the minhag Chabad, when it comes to girls, is that we name them as soon as possible, even hours after birth. In other kilos conditions be sold, there's different minhagim. Some people wait a minimum of 8 days to name a girl, with the understanding, just like it takes 8 days for a boy, it takes 8 days for a girl. But that's not how we hold. Because we don't say a woman doesn't have a bris. We say she's born already agamalate. Isha commanda mehila dami. And there's nafka minas nalocha. This is real. A woman, a Yiddish tochter, is born circumcised. She has a bris. So if she has a bris, she should have a name. So we name a daughter right away. And al pi Torah, whatever these things mean, you give a girl a name, you're beginning the neshama's entry into the guf. A boy has to wait 8 days for whatever reasons, but then you have a bris. When you have a bris, you give him a name, and the name is the beginning of the entry of the neshama to the person. It doesn't finish until the person turns bar mitzvah and bas mitzvah. At the age of 12, 13, the neshama enters completely. So the nefesh habahamis, the yetzer hara, is called melech zokin uksil, an alter nar, an old fool. The Rebbe Rayat used to call him their kluging kid, because he came first. Nefesh habahamis is there from birth. Selfishness, you don't have to learn. Yeah, it's part of our nature. The nefesh elokis doesn't enter till bar mitzvah until bas mitzvah, and therefore he's called yelid kotten o miskin, a young, vulnerable boy, because he comes in later. And that's the simple pshat of nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael. The simple pshat. Why do you call the neshama nefesh hashenis? Because he happens second. That's all. First you have one neshama, then you get a second neshama. First you have a nefesh habahamis, which is life, which more or less is equal by animals and plants and by minerals. And then later on, you get a nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael, which is a chelik hamamish, which doesn't enter into by mitzvah basket. Of course, the point is, you always have a neshama. An unborn baby has a neshama. The moment the baby is conceived, they have a neshama. But the gilui of the neshama, the revealing of the neshama in this person, that this being, this living thing, should be capable of what neshama inspires: selflessness and sacrifice and wanting emes. These characteristics of the neshama you do not get until bar mitzvah, you do not get until bas mitzvah. But here in the Rebbe's notes here, they bring nachapshat. Why do you call the neshama a nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael? This is interesting, and there's a lot of details, but I'll just give it a nekuda. The nekuda is because the full significance of a neshama isn't known until it's shenis. The neshama that's in my body, that's your body, was before we were born in Gan Eden. Wherever Gan Eden is, a lot of high levels. The way that neshama is lamayla, that neshama is not in touch with the fact that she's a chelik alakam imal. The true infinity of a neshama, the chelik alakam imal of the neshama, doesn't reveal itself till the neshama until it becomes shenis. In other words, the Rebbe says, how can you say that the nefesh elokis is called shenis because he comes second? We all understand nefesh elokis is much more important than the nefesh habahamis and the guf. So, okay, he comes second, but he comes second and he's the most important. Why are you calling him shenis? And the Teretz says the full power of what a neshama is not known to the neshama until the neshama is shenis. The neshama in Gan Eden is rishon. The neshama in Gan Eden is echad. The neshama in Gan Eden is yochid. The neshama in Gan Eden is not in touch with its own chelik alakam imal. The neshama in Gan Eden has limits in Gan Eden. Every world has limits. When does the neshama find out? When does the neshama find out that she's a chelik alakam imal? Only when she's a nefesh hashenis. When she meets a guf, when she meets nefesh habahamis, the neshama discovers her elikus. And therefore, nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael is not only saying it's second because it happened second, it's second because it only becomes what it is fully when it's in a condition of being second. Nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael. Okay? Was steht weiter? Chelik alakam imal mamish. I'm going to leave this for next time. I'm just going to set this up in Mizak. Chelik alakam imal mamish. So in a yem you have from the Rebbe Rashab. Chelek elakah mimal ruchnius sheberuchnius. Mamish gashmius shebegashmius. The Frierdiker Rebbe was a boy who learned Tanya with his father. And I told you the story so many times that when the Frierdiker Rebbe became a certain age, his father took him out of the cheder and he hired for him a private tutor. His private tutor was a very big chassid from Tzemach Tzedek. The Frierdiker Rebbe gerat wegen him G'daylos in the Tzuris. G'daylos in the Tzuris. We knew Jews who knew him. He passed away in Tafrei Samachay, 1905. But the Shmuel Levit not some Makabel Gelen Asach. I mean, we knew Yidden who knew Rashbatz. Rashbatz was a Talmud of Michal Apotzker, who was from G'daylich Sidat Morazakim. Anyway, he was a very big chassid. Rashbatz. The Frierdiker Rebbe described. I just saw a quote from Rashbatz. The Frierdiker Rebbe says, Rashbatz like sagen, jeder hat Ruach HaKodesh. The Rashbatz sagt sich auslachen. It's not the Ruach HaKodesh. I can't tell you the halarichas. It's like ganze word. But the Frierdiker Rebbe says, everybody has Ruach HaKodesh. The Rebbe is different, and he explained that nafka minute. Interessant. He was there in the Rashbatz. He had the incredible distinction of being the private malamed of two Rebbes. The private tutor of two Rebbes. Not two Rebbe Shekindah, two Rebbes. The Rebbe Marash hired him to be the private tutor of the Rebbe Rashab, and the Frierdiker Rebbe hired him to be the Rebbe Rashab hired him to be the tutor of the Frierdiker Rebbe. He gave us a sehr aggressive chassid. So the Frierdiker Rebbe was probably 11, and the Rashbats learned with him they had a whole seder. The Rashbats was his madrich. They slept in the same room. The hadracha was 24 hours a day. There was no such thing as a break. He put him to bed, he woke him up in the morning, he did negovas with him, and he died him also his gelerit, the Rashbats. And he also taught him Torah, but he didn't sit across the desk and say, read. He told the Frierdiker Rebbe, read from here to here, come back in 3 hours. You understand? You're not, the Frierdiker Rebbe was not a regular boy chick, even though he tries to describe himself as a regular boy chick. He wasn't a regular boy chick. He was his mother. And at a certain point, they started learning Tanya. So the Frierdiker Rebbe says, I'm not learning Tanya with you. He says, what do you mean I'm learning Tanya with me? This is the schedule, learn Tanya. He says, nope. Tanya learned not from Taten. Tanya I'm learning only from my father, from the Rebbe Rashab. So the Rashbad says, ich verstehe nicht. Ich habe gelernt mit deinen Taten, Tanya. I taught your father, I was your father's first Malanya, Lamed and Tanya. And Frierdiker comes, I'm sorry, my last name is Schneerson, and I'm in action. They argued for a long time, for days. Argued. These people didn't scream at each other or bang on the table, but they disagreed. There was an impasse. And the Rayatz, it's a hang action. If I can't learn Tanya from my father, I don't want to learn Tanya. So the Rashbats came to the Rebbe Rashab. The Rashab had the Derech for him. Couldn't he would stand up for him. And he said to the Rashab, I don't know, he's not behaving. He doesn't learn Tanya from me. So the Rebbe Rashab called the Frierdiker Rebbe and argued with him. Also said, what's wrong with learning the Rashbats? And Frierdiker Rebbe says, if I'm not learning from you, I'm not learning. And the Rebbe Rashab realized that his son was Takash Nes, legitimate. The genes were all there. Akshanas. So the Rebbe Rashab made it clear to learn with the Rebbe Rayatz Tanya. I think they learned Tanya together several times, more than once. Years later, the Rebbe Rashab said to the Frierdiker Rebbe, ich komme dir als Paltiel und Deik. Verein Akshan, nicht to learn in Tanya, not from here. The Rebbe Rashab told the Frierdiker Rebbe later, you were right. Thank you for insisting as an 11-year-old that you should learn Tanya only from me. So they learned Tanya more than once, twice or 3 times. And one time they were learning Tanya, they came to Perek Beis, the Rebbe Rashab said to the Frierdiker Rebbe, Chelek elakah mimal ruchnius sheberuchnius, mamish gashmius shebegashmius. What's on the Neshama? Ruchnius sheberuchnius, hybrided, bridged together, fused with gashmius shebegashmius. Here in these pages, there is a note from the Rebbe, Frierdiker Rebbe, a letter, where he writes that the word Chelek and elakah are contradictory, are a dichotomy, and mimal and mamish are also a contradiction. It's 2 times 2 opposites. Chelek elakah. Chelek means a metzias b'fnei atzmi. Elakah means not a metzias b'fnei atzmi. Mimal means the highest heights. Mamish means the lowest lows. A neshama, in its true definition, combines the highest and the lowest. What makes a neshama is not that it sits in Gan Eden. What makes a neshama that in this world it's also a neshama. Chelek elakah mimal mamish. Okay, and we'll continue with some next week. Li neder.